So good afternoon. Welcome back. And we're kind of going back where we started this morning. We're going back to literature now. It's a great pleasure to welcome Ulrich Baer, who will now talk to us about great books banned, aesthetic and legal judgments. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for staying and for inviting me, Susan and the staff at Einstein Forum. It's really nice to be here. I just said to Jenny the last time I was in this room was at the invitation of Tony Judd, who we missed very much a very long time ago. A kind of secret meeting changed my life in a good way. And I want to take you into a scene in a 1937 novel by the American writer Zora Neale Hurston, and I'm going to present a scene to you from a book. And my idea is that from that scene, which is a scene of judgment, we can maybe think together about the way the so-called left critiques or cancels ideas and the so-called right does so, because that scene kind of dramatically stages such a confrontation. But it's a work of literature which I think maybe allows us to think about that somewhat dispassionately and to take positions that in real life we wouldn't like to take. So the story of Their Eyes Were Watching God is Janie Crawford, a young woman who, in the beginning of the novel, comes into her own puberty and her own sexuality, and her grandmother decides this is a very risky thing for a young woman and marries her off. And Janie Crawford, in the story of this novel, is first married to a man who thinks fantastic, young, beautiful, strong wife, another hand at the plow, she can help me in the household, and Janie doesn't like this, to be treated like another asset. So Janie leaves this first man for a second man who thinks, well, Janie is this amazing person, she's now growing up, a woman, and he puts her on a pedestal. He's the self-declared mayor of a small, unincorporated black town in Florida, and she becomes the first lady of this town, but she doesn't like sitting on the porch and being revered and loved in that way. And then the third story, which is the final story of this book, Janie then meets a man called Tea Cake. It's his nickname. He's younger. He plays the guitar. They play checkers. They fall in love. She elopes with him, and they go to the muck, which is kind of swampland by a lake in Florida, where they're cutting sugarcane, and they live together, and there's a deep, true, genuinely thrilling love between them, Janie and Tea Cake, and then something terrible happens. There's a big storm, the levees break, it's an actual historical event. A rabid dog bites Tea Cake, and he contracts rabies, loses his mind, attacks Janie, and she has to shoot him in the moment of self-defense. So the scene I'm taking you now is Janie standing on trial. It's 1937, roughly, sort of the novel is set roughly in the period when it was written. So Zora Neale Hurston gives you a black woman on trial. There's a white judge, there's a white prosecutor, there's a white public defendant, and there are 12 white jurors. So she has to now testify and defend her life, because if she has shot her lover out of malice, jealousy, they fell out of love, she will actually be sentenced to possibly death or something very severe. And in the back of the room, you have the black community, and quote, "Their tongues cocked and loaded, the only real weapon left to weak folks, the only killing tool they are allowed to use in the presence of white folks," end of quote. So the black community standing on the back of the room, a wind goes through them and rustles them, and they want to speak and say what Janie really did, and they're not allowed to speak, and someone tells them, if you know what's good for you, you're going to now shut up and be quiet. So there's silence, but there's the black community in the back of the room, ready to judge her, their tongues cocked and loaded. Now she's put on the stand, and she's asked to testify. And at this moment, when there's a kind of legal proceeding in a novel, she actually doesn't do what she's obliged to do. She's now expected to plead for her life. And then Hurston writes, she didn't plead to anybody. She just sat there and told, and when she was through, she hushed. And before that, they said, they all leaned over to listen while she talked. First thing she had to remember was she was not at home. She was in the courthouse fighting something, and it wasn't death. It was worse than death. It was lying thoughts. She had to go way back to let them know how she and Tea Cake had been with one another, so they could see that she could never shoot Tea Cake out of malice. So what I'm trying to let you see is how Hurston sets up a very dramatic scene of a black woman on trial for murder in the white South, white-governed South in the 1930s. And instead of testifying and obeying the demand of the law to actually explain herself, she then tells the story of their love. And I'll tell you in a couple of moments how I've misunderstood this. And I couldn't understand why at this moment she wouldn't actually just plead for her life, because isn't survival the most important thing? And I think what Janie Crawford is doing at that moment, she has chosen life over life. She shot Tea Cake, her lover, in self-defense. She killed the person she loved who gave her happiness in order to live more. Secondly, then, she decides, I couldn't live with lying thoughts. And I was thinking about what Justice Sachs said yesterday. So what does the law actually demand of us? It's to testify in the terms of the law. And Janie Crawford and Zora Neale Hurston here actually avoid that logic, refuse that logic that the law demands us to have a certain kind of stable story and identity that the law can interpret, and she tells the story of her love. In a way, what she does, she tells the story of the entire novel. She just recounts what I just recounted to you. It's the entire novel, and she basically understands. So in the novel, you have this meta moment where in the moment of when justice comes in, she stages this, Hurston stages this, and then she recaps the entire novel for you. So now you are also sitting in the audience here as the readers, so it's no longer just the black community, and it's no longer just the white jurors, but now the readers, we are also actually adjudicating what is the story of their love. And what I'm interested in is when she says it was not death she feared, it was misunderstanding. It was lying thoughts. And what could Janie not live with? So she could have been sentenced to death because of her refusal to testify. She actually doesn't testify. So she risks everything in the name of something greater than everything. What is that? She risks everything. She risks her life in the name of not living a life that is actually living death. And what would that have meant? That would have meant that she would have actually defended herself, been acquitted, but people would have failed to see that she really loved Tea Cake. And why would that be living death? Because she actually had loved, had lived a full moment in her life that given her so much meaning. And if people had thought that was inauthentic and she shot him out of jealousy, there was another woman, he betrayed her, love faded, etc., she would have been in a community where people would have judged her constantly in a way that's different from the legal judgment she was about to actually await there or defend herself against. It would have been a social judgment, a different kind of judgment, right? And I asked one of the tremendous, wonderful biographers of Zora Neale Hurston, Deborah Plant, who's an independent scholar, many, many years ago. I asked this question. I said, why is she not testifying at this case? It's confusing to me. And she said, Deborah Plant, who's a very thoughtful, incredible scholar and rather reticent, kind of quiet. And she said, oh, Ulrich, you misunderstood the entire book. And I said, why? And she said, because once you've truly been in love, for people not to understand that part and to think you actually betrayed the person you loved once, which is a ghost in Jenny's words, a ghost from the past, life is worth nothing to you. And I'm interested in this distinction between that life is in the balance and the court can give her life or death. And the social world is actually what gives her life that is a death in life, a lifeless life. And so I want to set it up to think there's the black community, their tongues cocked and loaded, and they do not like Janie. So I'm going to fan out a little bit right now, and it connects to some things. I'm sorry Thomas isn't here anymore. So Zora Neale Hurston's book is the story of a black woman who kind of finds herself, discovers herself, ultimately finds happiness, and that happiness ends in terrible tragedy of really tremendous dimensions. The black community doesn't like her because she's had a younger lover. They lived in sin. They didn't get married. She didn't have children. She actually just enjoyed herself. She's a real threat to their community values, and they're ready, in our today's language, to cancel her, to ostracize her, to exclude her, and all of this. So let me say, for the moment, I'll just put the black community in the place of liberals or the progressive left that expects their own to behave in a certain way and sees their own as failing many times for not being liberal enough, not doing what they want them to do. And then I'll set up you're going to be part of this, regrettably, but you have to be the jurors. This is white society. You're sitting in judgment here, and you're the conservatives who are actually having the power of the state behind you. Partly why I'm using this as an allegory, because I want to make very clear that I see it as an entirely false equivalence to equate the cancel culture on the left with the state censorship and repression we're seeing in America right now. And Susan and I disagree a little bit. I think it is entirely actually mistaken to fall into this trap to say the left has canceled books and canceled people, and therefore let's abolish entire library systems. And let me just stay for a moment here, because I'm on the witness stand right now, so you have to hold your tongue is cocked and loaded, and that is actually good. And if you know what's good for you. So I'm just quoting Zora Neale Hurston. So Zora Neale Hurston brings you into this moment to say the progressive, your community, which we would read, and I put myself into this position when I said to Deborah Plant, I don't get it. In a way, she said, she didn't say it like this, she was very kind. She said, you misunderstood the entire book. I'm a literary scholar, so that's a bit of a letdown for me. And she said essentially, you've missed everything because you're reading the book as a work of sociology, as a work of politics, and as a work of history. And if you look at it from that angle, then you're right. Black woman on trial, probably biased white juror, white public defender, white prosecutor. She doesn't stand a chance, she has to defend herself. That, if you read it like that, then her choice to not testify is incomprehensible. It seems self-defeating, it seems actually suicidal, it seems insane. But if you read it as a work of fiction that generates a moment within itself, where someone chooses life over life and chooses in a moment of intense vitality to be heard and recognized as such, the way Jenny showed us this moment today, when Arthur Mitchell and Diana, Adams, when they dance, for one moment, there were audiences in New York that saw a black and white couple. An incredible beauty, vulnerability, grace, dependency, sort of submission, dominance, power. They saw something that was politically not possible, that was socially not possible, and we have historians in the room that historians would say this didn't happen. Because historically, looking from the larger framework of society, this didn't happen. But of course, it happened all the time in embodied life. So Zora Neale Hurston, I think, wants to give you this moment to say, in this moment, Janie Ward embodies something that cannot be captured through other disciplines, sociology, the law, political analysis, etc. And it actually cannot be captured also outside of literature. Literature actually makes possible to hold a moment, to consider that moment to be real, which is not yet actualized in reality, without turning it into a utopia and a kind of political program. So this is the setup. So why does the black community not like her? Because she's a woman who doesn't follow the rules of their community. Why does the white community doesn't like her? Because she's a black woman, she killed a man, and they want to sentence her because law and order, etc. So from two sides, you have an attempt to actually silence somebody, and she somehow chooses a different way, speaks, writes this novel. And then a couple other things happen. I'll just add these to complicate this a bit. Then Janie, that night, she gets out of the courthouse, uncomfortably for some literary critics. The people who are really behind her on her side is a wall of white women who actually connect to her, who stand and protect her in a way from her own community. So by now, we are no longer very safe to say she's a black woman in the black community, sociological reading. She's now a woman who has been in love, protected by women who may know what that have meant to have been in love with somebody. And these white women are standing as a wall protecting her. Then she checks into a boarding house that night. She has to sleep somewhere because her home is not right there. And there are people on the porch, and she overhears them. And they say a sentence, which is also a kind of difficult sentence for literary criticism to absorb. She says, well, you know what they say. A white man and an N-word woman is the freest thing on earth. They do as they please. So why does Zora Neale Hurston introduce a kind of bystander, a neutral observer, after the court scene to say a white man and a black woman are the freest thing on earth? Because the black woman, and this is Kimberly Crenshaw, came up yesterday with intersectionality, in a way Zora Neale Hurston says, when you're already doubly marginalized, you're totally free whatever you want to do because no community will be behind you. As a black woman, to live out your love, your desire, your sexuality, your self-determination makes you more free or as free as a white man. It's a complicated statement if you want to read Zora Neale Hurston, and I'll get to this in a moment, as one of the great authors in the canon of black women writing, right? And I'll tell you one other thing about this. So I was not wrong only once when I misunderstood the old book. So I also asked Deborah Plant, so when Alice Walker, the author of The Colored Purple, which is a book you should reread, is one of the few books that has made me laugh and cry on the same page. Literally, I was in Miami at a hotel and I'm crying and my son said, "Are you okay?" And then I said, "No, I'm laughing already," in one page. So Alice Walker goes to Florida in 1975 and recovers Zora Neale Hurston and finds the grave, the unmarked grave of Zora Neale Hurston, because Zora Neale Hurston, the great star of the Harlem Renaissance, is rather forgotten by the 1970s. On Wikipedia, there's an entire entry, the rediscovery of the eyes were watching God, with footnotes to scholars. So I said to Deborah Plant, so when Alice Walker rediscovered Zora Neale Hurston, a book largely forgotten, also banned occasionally, so there's a book ban question here behind this somewhere, but largely forgotten because black woman writer, etc., are not canonized at this time. And then Deborah Plant said, oh, yeah, Alice Walker and the other womanists and feminists, they claimed they discovered that book. We always had that book. We had it mimeographed, we had copies, we all knew this book existed. This book spoke to us, we always knew. So she's pointing out to me, you have no idea what you're talking about because you've studied literary history and you're absorbing this sort of knowledge, that settled knowledge, that Zora Neale Hurston was forgotten, yet it wasn't forgotten for people like me. We've always read it. So the idea that books get banished and books get recovered and the canon is revived, Zora Neale Hurston was always part of the canon, depends on who you ask, right? Then Zora Neale Hurston becomes one of the most widely taught novels in American college curriculum. So most American colleges actually assign it at some point as one of the great works of American fiction. I happen to agree with that assessment. But I happen to agree with it for the reasons I try to identify, that it is not because it is written by a black woman, but because it is one of the great stories of someone who actually escapes all the strictures, limitations, and expectations of the political historical reality she is, to speak from a place that I would call literature, which is an experience that is more deeper than usual time and that only literature can actually capture and convey for us. The last sentence of that book is something she pulls the horizon, she pulls in her horizon like a great fishnet, so much life caught in its meshes. And she drapes it around her shoulders and she calls her soul, she asks her soul to come in and take a look. This is how the book ends. She's alone on the porch and she pulls the horizon around her, drapes it around her shoulders, so much life caught in its meshes, which is a really strange metaphor and weird because where's the life caught? A mesh is actually a hole, it's an absence. Caught, asks her soul to come in and take a look. That's how the book ends. So to step back, so my question is, and when I corresponded with Susan about my talk, I was trying to understand where the incredible excitement comes from on two sides, on the liberal left side, to actually prohibit or limit the use of some words and books, and where does it come in from the right side, the conservatives? And both sides get rather excited in some cases. I teach in a university, I teach, and actually I'm a literary scholar, so I have to actually chastise my previous panel for getting Uncle Tom reference completely wrong. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you reread that book, Uncle Tom saves two young women at the end and sacrifices his own life by not betraying their hiding place. Uncle Tom is not a traitor to his race. It is important to note that. I think it is important to read books closely, and I think it is important not to repeat malicious stereotypes, even about fictional characters. So I'm sorry you were wrong about that use of Uncle Tom. It is really wrong, and it's actually a racial slur that was invented by people who hated Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 1860s and has been regrettably taken up by everybody, including this panel. So I'm just sitting in judgment for a moment right here. I just changed positions with Albie. So there's that. But so where does the right, and Daniel, and if I talked about this, we talked about it this morning a little bit on the right here, there's a kind of fantasy that literature has what Daniel calls kind of this magical belief that words can make us actually not just do things, but be things. The rage on the right now is pretty broad, actually. They started banning books like, about little queer penguins, and now they're banning books that are classics, and West Point Academy has removed half a canon. So there's a very serious repressive effort by the government, with the force of the government behind it, to remove books. Ohio has just passed a law that Ohio State University professors have to publicize all their syllabi. They have to make that publicly available. They can be called out for teaching the wrong books. Academic freedom, freedom of speech, which were misunderstood concepts 8 years ago in the university. I wrote a book about that. They were misunderstood by the university 8 years ago, to the university's great, great harm. And the Trump administration has used that misunderstanding to weaponize equality legislation in the name of anti-Semitism, and to actually weaponize academic freedom and to weaponize all sorts of things that the university actually failed to explain for itself against itself. That's a whole other talk, but it's related to this. So the right attacks books for the reason, kind of what Daniel calls magical thinking, as if language can sort of make you be something. You read a book about a penguin and then you turn out liking guys. It just doesn't work that way. I can tell you, I didn't take a book on penguins, like it's not how it works. There's a kind of overemphasis, and secondly, no one really reads books anyways. So why is this? And that's actually quite important. And no one reads books, and very few people actually in America go to Harvard University, right? So like very few people go to Harvard University, and Harvard University until 10 weeks ago was actually not really well liked by the American public. Let's admit that, right? Harvard University is now the kind of freedom and resistance fighter in America by default. But why is it? Because the right wants to attack things that we attribute prestige to. That's the first thing. Secondly, they want to actually attack the imagination and creative potential. I was talking to Fintan earlier today. I could have given this talk on the Oscar Wilde trial, which I do not believe is a trial about gay rights. I actually think what's on trial is literature itself. And it's a very important trial for us today still, that Oscar Wilde goes to prison for the love that dare not speak his name. He really goes to prison for writing books, actually, because the trial is entirely made up of, you wrote this in this book, doesn't that mean that? Which is very important because we tend to read it through a legal lens and say, here's a sort of trial about sodomy, homosexuality. No, it's a trial about literature. That happened in the 1890s. The British government was gracious enough, I think, in 2010 to pardon Oscar Wilde. It took until then. It only took 112 years. Probably because he's Irish, and they felt he deserved everything he got, right? There's that. Because how could the greatest British playwright since Shakespeare not be British, but Irish, actually? But so the right attacks things that have prestige. That's called books, which nobody reads and nobody buys, really, of the great American public. Secondly, they attack things that have a claim to a type of discourse that I try to identify with Jane that actually asserts your life is not entirely overdetermined by politics, the law, the courts, but is filled with meaning from within. The right wants to actually limit that, and the right actually wants us to believe, which is complicated, that the courts will be our salvation, that politics and the law are everything, while they're dismantling every legal protection that anybody's been afforded. And what I said this morning or earlier is that the law has to be filled with meaning, that actually it has to become embodied and enlivened by people exercising their right to be free, that if you're given the right to be free to do whatever you want, wear sandals or whatever it is, you have to wear sandals to make that law real. There's nothing real about the law until people enact and embody this. And then the left. Why does the left actually have problems with books? So I teach in a university, as I said. I teach books such as Huckleberry Finn, Their Eyes Were Watching God. There are N-words all over the place. I think it's 256 times in Huckleberry Finn. In Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, the N-word shows up 16 times on one page. And I wrote about this, why, and there are people, my colleagues, who said, I wouldn't touch Huckleberry Finn, I wouldn't teach it anymore. And there are instances, and that's fine because you're free to teach what you want. That's not censorship. There's no government agency. There's no one who told me you're not allowed to do it. People just don't do it. The other instance is a bit more troubling because institutional power is behind them. So the great American writer Junot Díaz, who was represented in the Norton Anthology of American Literature until this year, had a short story in there. It's a great story. He's a really great writer. And the short story was removed because of an unsubstantiated Me Too claim that has actually been sort of gone away because it wasn't real. And the Norton people, who are not the government, however have cultural power, did admit somewhere, yes, we removed Junot because of this thing. So now there's no Latino writer in the anthology anymore. So there's a problem on the left as well. However, I don't think this problem amounts to what we're seeing in the Trump administration. And I said at lunch to somebody, I live in a world where I hardly have time to think about what happened a year ago and are we to blame for Trump's election, what's happening. There's so many things happening I have to deal with on a daily basis. So, but I do want to venture something, which I'd be curious what people have to say about this, that the left did, of course, open the door to something. And the culture and the canon wars of the 1990s, which I actually found really important at that time, and Harold Bloom, who was one of my teachers, was sort of dragged into it, and at the end of his life deeply, deeply regretted wasting time talking about the canon wars. He said that was not worth anything. The canon wars were fought in the name of sociology, in the name of political representation, of identification, in the name of experience as a certain kind of access to reality that isn't available to everybody. What Thomas was talking about with the question, so I'm sorry, I don't know your name, about as a person belonging to a certain group, do you have certain access to experience that cannot be actually responded to by an argument? Let me go back to the Janie scene here. Janie is on a witness stand, and all she says is, I had an experience. I would be curious what, Justice Sachs, what you would say, because an experience is not an argument. And I close with this, so I wanted to sort of illustrate what's at stake. The right censors things for the following reasons, and it does that also partly to distract us from other things. It bans a book here and there, and it bans a book about a trans kid or something, it bans things, and it doesn't allow Sesame Street to talk about diversity anymore, so Sesame Street now talks about resilience. So it sort of limits a certain kind of discourse, but it does that also to distract us from the real harm and the real cost that is borne by real people who are individuals who will not get treated in hospitals anymore because their identity doesn't exist. So there's real harm on the ground, and in some ways these are just sort of the culture wars are both vitally important and also distractions from other things. On the left, when people say we don't teach Huckleberry Finn, we don't teach Hemingway, we wouldn't touch even Zora Neale Hurston, because Zora Neale Hurston isn't quite the feminist you want her to be. She isn't quite the black writer you want her to be. Zora Neale Hurston in her own life, troublingly, did not agree with the board, the Brown versus Board of Education, because she said, I don't need to be in a schoolroom with white children to feel smart. Why would you want that to happen, actually? How about making our schools much better? Wasn't exactly popular, isn't exactly popular today, but Zora Neale Hurston doesn't fit into something and yet teaches us something essential, that books actually defy both the kind of expectation on the right, whatever the right wants. They do not want us to read, for sure. They do not want us to read anything, actually, and even what they're proposing as a history curriculum, you'll talk about this tomorrow, it's not history. It's some flat propaganda for some kind of supremacy or something. It's not reading. And the left is overly sensitive, maybe, that it wants books to have a progressive message. And when it doesn't fit in, we don't know what to do with it, really. So when I wrote this piece on Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, which has come out of copyright, it's too bad for the Hemingway heirs, because it sold roughly 300,000 copies in America because it's still taught in high schools. And it starts out on day one that Roger Cohen was Jewish, but his nose was bashed in a Princeton boxing club, which possibly improved his appearance. So you're thinking, wait, you have anti-Semitism on page 1, and then you have sort of, and The Great Gatsby, as you know, when the Buchanans host lunch in the Hamptons, it's not really the Hamptons, but I imagine it's the Hamptons, and they have a beautiful lunch, and what does he talk about first? Daisy's husband, about the great replacement theory, that white people will replace. It's 1926, The Great Gatsby, the novel that had inspired so many weddings. They don't read the ending, they don't know he ends up dead in the pool. And it's sort of thinking, So American literature contains within it, as Toni Morrison showed in Playing in the Dark in 1991, contains within it the absolutely necessary presence of marginalized figures to prop up a kind of hierarchy. But Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Hurston, they do this in a way that actually complicates our simplistic understanding that this book is on the right side of history. So the left responds in some phobic way as strongly as the right to and I really want to be careful here, cancel. Cancelled, what does that really mean? Do people actually, they don't go to prison, you know, they're not dragged and, you know, kidnapped in the street and locked up in cells? This is not what we're talking about here. So the left is really, I really want to say there's a false equivalent to cancel culture here and repression on the right. But I thought, I talked to Susan on an email about this, I thought I'd end right here, and I would like to hear what you think about these two different approaches and how, in a way, what I'm trying to say, the book that I used as an example that stages this court scene doesn't fit into these narratives neatly. So O'Neill Hurston was rediscovered by Alice Walker, the great womanist, instantly attacked by black male writers for actually bashing men. Toni Morrison was also criticized as such and beloved for actually having negative representations of black men. So these books actually do something that the right believes. The right believes we threw out Milton and Shakespeare and, you know, Walt Whitman, our great queer national poet, I guess. And this is sort of funny and not funny. The Emily Dickinson Museum's funding has been suspended because probably they Googled it and AI generated that Emily Dickinson was gay or something. So they just, like, you know, it hits people hard. But what I'm saying is when the canon wars happened, we replaced a lot of books with black women writers. So O'Neill Hurston, thankfully, wonderfully. I was delighted. I was at Harvard and studied with Barbara Johnson, and the course was called Black Women Writers. It was the first such course at an American university, at an elite top university. There was 400 students. It was an amazing class. And at the same time, those books don't fit into a very progressive mold because O'Neill Hurston's perspective isn't properly progressive. It doesn't fit in. The Brown versus Board of Education is only one instance. But there's a kind of uncomfortable resistance to be co-opted into a political story by these books. So I'll stop right here, and I would love to have conversation and discussion. I will not start with Susan, because you've been number one, and every time you'll be the last question, though, to keep this tradition. And I can now, I mean, you can call on people. You can call on Susan.
That's what. No,
okay, Susan.
No, that's my task. But you're right, Susan.
I am not going to comment on your excellent talk, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But I do have to respond to two claims you made about me.
Yes.
Mea culpa on Uncle Tom.
Thank you.
Although I did reread that book fairly recently and remember noting that Uncle Tom was actually a very noble figure and wondering how that caricature got started. So thank you for enlightening me on that.
White supremacists in the 1850s who wanted to attack and discredit that book.
So thank you for that. Yeah. Howsoever, on the other claim, my name is not Yasha Monk. I don't even agree with Thomas on a number of things politically, although I like him. And the only word that I ever wrote about cancel culture was the first sentence of my book, Left is Not Woke, which is, this is not a book about cancel culture. So.
Thank you. Yes, okay, all right.
Are there other questions? Oh, do you want to respond? No. Are there other questions, comments? Amber, please.
This is just an observation that might turn into a question. When you were talking about Their Eyes Are Watching God and how it's not a sociological book, it's not a history book and so on, but it's about this personal love and relationship and so on. I was reminded very much of 1984 and what the state needs to crush. I mean, Orwell's very clear about it. What the state needs to crush about their relationship is precisely that it's not political. They don't have any non-political, they don't have any sort of contrarian politics. They're not activists. They just have a relationship with each other, which isn't controlled by the state, and that's what the state has to crush. Or at least that's how Orwell puts it. So I was reminded very much of that, of the political power of the personal not being political. We can put it that way. But what struck me in your discussion of that book and the two reasons from left and right for disliking it is it seems that on both sides there's an increasing intolerance for ambiguity. Yes? No? What do you think?
No, there's always been intolerance for ambiguity because it's very difficult to fit it into categories that can be used politically. And we want to have some categories we can use. And if there's ambiguity, I said what Jenny did, I thought there's a productive tension between the bizarre thing that people who train their bodies to transcend the body reach a state of immanence that is so present and so filled with presence. And I wanted to say productive tension, not paradox, not ambiguity. That is the power of art to remind us that ambiguity can be generative, can actually allow us to see the future, not just in terms given to us from the present, but it doesn't allow for a political program. So I wanted to make a clear distinction. You know, the law deals with ambiguity constantly, or it's balancing. We talked about this at lunch. There are conflicting rights. I wrote a book on free speech, I think 8 years ago, when I thought the university are dumb enough not to understand they're being used as theaters to wage a culture war, which they actually gave ground on every single day and kept on saying, yes, free speech is absolute, academic freedom is the First Amendment, wrong, wrong. And you're thinking, how dumb were they to not understand? And they had to figure out, and then this is what, you know, this is jurisprudence, that equality, which the Trump administration is exploiting to undo free speech, to undo academic freedom, was a discovery by Catherine McKinnon that equality and free speech can be in tension and have to be balanced in a way. And balancing is I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I'll stop right here. So ambiguity exists, and is there more intolerance? I don't think so. I actually think what's happened, and this is a sort of taking a step back, what happened is that people's voices are being heard that make people confused, and they think this is ambiguous because things used to be so clear. We talked about this morning in the car, that there used to be free speech everywhere. And then all these crazy woke students came along, and then no one can say anything anymore. I said, well, no, there used to be people with power. They were limited platforms called the media, and those people talked a lot. And then other people started claiming their voices, demanding their voices, becoming introduced into the canon, and then they also got the internet as a present, and then they realized we can participate. Now there's ambiguity. Now there's not just ambiguity, but total confusion. And so, so what if there's more ambiguity? Yeah. What if you look at me and I'm going to say, this is my pronoun now, and get you all confused? Like, so okay, so deal with it. You know, it's like I'm thinking to sort of say, oh, there used to be less ambiguity. I used to know. Like, it's gone. It doesn't matter. Like, there is ambiguity in the world. So is there more right now? There's less tolerance? No. No, my students are really low. No, I think I'm very comfortable living with ambiguity. I don't know if there's less tolerance. I think the right, I would say, pretends to have less tolerance for ambiguity because they have incredible tolerance for hypocrisy. So they will say, it's all like this, and then you think, what are you talking about? It's all like this, and you are dismantling the legal protections for equality, for speech, for all of this. And we're saying, in the name of free speech and equality. So they have high tolerance for hypocrisy, dishonesty, and say, we're eliminating ambiguity. We're finally getting rid of all this nonsense, all this woke language, etc. In the name of what? Of total repression? In the name of silencing. So they actually have no tolerance. The left is saddled with its own problem that we live with too much ambiguity, and we like because we can never settle on things really because we are too principled. So that, I mean, I'm not telling you anything new. You know that, yeah.
Ben.
I had two thoughts. One was following on from your opening, which I read to mean that the right marches in through gates opened by other people, or they leave spaces for the right. And I wondered if you wanted to say more about that. The second was about trials, where you said the Oscar Wilde trial was about literature, not about sodomy. I'm wondering what you could say in a similar manner about the D.H. Lawrence trial, the Lady Chatterley trial, which, as I understand it, was lost on the barrister's statement. Is this a book you would want your wife or your servants to read? And some people figured that wives didn't behave as dependents and there were no more servants.
I don't know if the trials are the same, slightly different maybe. State censorship has existed since Plato. It's not new, it's important. It's an important function of government to regulate what the people can consume. The government does it all the time, constantly, so it's not always censorship. It's also prescriptive. We set curricula, we want books to be read, etc. I'm really curious what, as a historian, you think we should learn history. It's not that we shouldn't learn history, we should learn the right kind of history. And tomorrow we're going to hear about what's the right kind of history. And we have this, is 1619 the correct history? Is, the founding fathers as our great heroes. So the D.H. Lawrence, what I can't quite get to, I think there's something that at the heart of this is the right wants to regulate a lot of things. And one thing it wants to regulate, it wants to restore the kind of Oedipal or patriarchal relationships that regulate sexuality. And women are actually really the target. Race is not, I don't think race is actually, I think race is not the target in America. I think it's women. It's also a target, of course, but it's not the main target. And secondly, the left also doesn't know what to do with sexuality, so it actually over-politicizes it and turns everybody's behavior into identities. As we know, it doesn't really work that way. Then they're solidly locked into that. And sort of the sexuality and the expression of it, especially female sexuality, is actually at the heart of some of these things. And that's why, for a long time, people said they're all obscenity trials. It's always obscenity or pornography. The big 90s cases, the big Supreme Court cases about Karen Finley and all those people, they were obscenity trials and pornography trials. They were rehearsals for today. And even then, the left didn't quite know, because the left said, well, but maybe we should go much further and allow everything. And so the left didn't know what to do, so they left and they kind of won a little bit, but also didn't. Karen Finley is my colleague. She had police protection for many years. She couldn't perform in public. So it wasn't actually a victory at all. But the left doesn't know what to do with this issue either, I think. And it turns it into a political tool, and it isn't that. That's why I wanted to sort of look at Janie Crawford. She actually refuses the demands placed on her by her black community and by the white establishment, and steps out of it. And the fate of this book is interesting, that the book was sort of forgotten, recovered, banned, criticized. And for me, it's a powerful example of what is the purpose and point of teaching literature, is to teach students actually what is there in life that is irreducible to a political category or a legal category, and yet must be framed ultimately as a political or legal right, I think on some level, but something, and the question about earlier about love, Hannah Arendt has this famous moment when she says the outrage is not school desegregation. She was terribly wrong and said schools maybe shouldn't be deregulated by the government, the Little Rock essay. And in that essay, she said, the great scandal is the laws against miscegenation. The state must never interfere in a love relationship. That is absolutely private, removes the world, it is not political, all that. She wants to carve out this space. I think she wants to carve out this space right here. She happens to call it love. It's worldless, therefore cannot be politicized. It's an amazing fantasy, a mystery. I hope you all experience that once in your life or several times. It's an amazing thing, but it's actually ephemeral the way Jenny talked about today. You can't really put a number on it, a name on it, and I'm supposed to call myself all sorts of labels now. And then my relationship is supposed to fit into that label. That's politics, awesome, really important. I want all those rights. But Hannah Arendt says it's already the wrong approach. That something has to stay out of that, yeah.
Kristen.
And then, yeah.
So you made a really interesting dichotomy between sort of the state censorship where you go to jail and you lose freedom, autonomy. Your job, right. And cancel culture, which is a kind of silencing that it doesn't have the same sort of consequences. And as somebody who studies communism in Eastern Europe, there's often a discussion about proper censorship, right? And this sort of self-censorship when you feel like you know that you can't say this, and so you don't even write it to begin with. And I'm thinking, in the contemporary moment, one of the best things that could happen to a novelist is to have a book banned. Because in my bookstores, there are literally tables of banned books, which increase sales, which actually give those books. And even in the most oppressive Soviet or East European context, there was samizdat, and people were circulating manuscripts that were officially banned. But the cancel culture is a very different kind of censorship, because it's a censorship that becomes internalized. And it seeps in a deeper way. And it seems to me that even though you may not lose your freedom or your autonomy or your livelihood, it's a deeper kind of loss of consciousness and conscience. It's the more dangerous to me, but I'd be curious if you believe that you said they're not the same, but they work in very interesting parallel ways.
I can't put a hierarchy on them. That's what, it's worse than death. It's lying thought. She lives a living death to live in a community that got her off the hook, and then they all look at her and say, you actually killed your lover out of malice. It's a living death, and it's very real for people to live in that way. It's a living death. So that she chooses life over life, but she risks her life to live, not living death. Whether it's worse or not, I don't know. It's not for me to judge people's experiences. If you lose your job, if you lose your livelihood, if you're driven out of town, and this happens to people, librarians, etc., school teachers, what's worse or not? I don't know. And I'm just trying to say, at this moment in America, I think more people are afraid of actually losing their jobs than being canceled by somebody on X. Not sure, but I think you're raising a question that I wanted to raise, and I say I'm not sure whether one is worse than the other. I think right now we have more cases of state censorship of books. And I'll ask the writers in the room, I don't think it's good to have your book censored. I don't think so. I think to be in one of the alternative bookshops and say banned books, you know where your books are being sold in America? 72% on Amazon. So if Amazon gets a directive, this book is now banned, and Amazon removes it, your book is not sold anymore to most people in America. So it's tricky to say it gives you this prestige, you're a censored author, you're the resistance. I don't know. Fintan, yeah.
Okay, no, my job.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay, I have a list. Since we have lots of questions and not so much time anymore, I'm going to take two questions together now.
Thank
yeah,
you.
right?
Sorry.
That's what you.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Rainey and Alida are the next two. Yeah.
Sorry, no.
A question about timing. It's surely not unprecedented for the humanities to be hijacked by a political agenda in the history of the university. But this particular turn came at exactly the moment when the humanities were already under fire because they could no longer compete with either the natural sciences or the social sciences in terms of the pragmatic results that they could promise. And I wonder what you think about the susceptibility of the humanities in particular to a certain kind of moral fervor under the name of relevance in those circumstances.
And Alida.
Thanks very much for that wonderful talk.
Actually, it's Alida's turn first. Sorry, but I have you on my list. Don't worry.
I would like to come back to the term tolerance, and would like to replace it by or ambivalence, tolerance, ambivalence, by complexity. And in order to show why I think complexity is very important. First of all, I would like to say that it relates to the reading experience, because reading is giving us an experience to enjoy more complexity in the world than we usually do. I mean, that's a real chance. And in terms of its relation to identities, I just would like to say that yesterday I had a very liberating moment in this conference when I listened to R.B. Sachs. And when you actually told us the way in which the process advanced, in which you worked on the Constitution, because it was not a finished project, it was a work in progress. And then there was always the formula, there were the people out there. So there was a direct response to what was going on in the society, but it was a very careful and very also attentive response to what was going on out there. And there was a demand on the judge to create some space for this. And there was a new paragraph or whatever it was that had to be inserted. And in this way, the Constitution was used in order to create new laws. And I was really amazed that this process can be discussed in this particular way, which has a liberating effect, an effect that complexity is being valued, and there is no sense of polarization. We are totally out of the frame of all the culture war rhetorics in which we are caught up, and of which I'm so much fed up. So I just wanted to say that was for me very liberating, and I would like to reconnect to that spirit in this discussion.
Let's take one more from Finton.
Sorry, he's not the next one.
Oh, take the next one. Take one.
Okay, you want me to have one more? So that's the lady next to Glenn Most. So you had a question, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I was interested in this contrasting experience. Susan, should I wait? Yeah.
Sorry.
Francisca, it's Francisca's job now.
Yeah. No, he asked me to do it, so I'm gonna.
I just know that we're that talking about
yeah.
the times that somebody has a plane.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if Uli can answer 3 questions at once, I usually find that
I'll try.
Please, let him know.
I was interested in the contrast between experience and argument, and you're presenting the character in a novel's choice to go with telling a story instead of giving reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm to participate in a Du Bois conference next week, so I was hoping you could help me do my homework in saying a little Du Bois.
Oh, I thought divorce. Oh okay, wow. I'm so sorry.
Not yet. Yeah.
But I can help you with that too.
Yeah. Okay,
Been through that.
I'll talk to you afterwards. Yeah,
right,
because
Du Bois. All right, okay.
W.E.D. Du Bois
Yeah.
does the same, right?
Yeah.
So at some point he switches, he gives up on scientific reasoning, on logic, and starts telling stories, or at least does kind of mix of both. And the question is, why do that? And what is the power of storytelling? What is this? I mean, it's an aesthetic experience, and your talk is titled that, right? Aesthetic judgment or whatever. So it's an aesthetic experience, or what do we learn from a story that we cannot learn from an argument, I guess.
So the humanities question, so thank you for that question. So it's really vitally important. So I run the Center for Humanities at NYU. I was vice provost at New York University, which was the largest private university in America, North America. So the humanities, yes, are particularly susceptible to political pressure. They're also being blamed within the university for causing all the problems, that if we didn't have the humanities, we wouldn't have these problems. There's no solidarity yet, really, that between, and if I give you the stark choice that is taken from history, from Poland, Hungary, and the United States, if we had to get rid of gender studies to save the medical school, what would you do? And everybody would sacrifice gender studies, except people in gender studies. And that is the choice that's being put to the universities in a way to carve yourself up and do the work of the Republicans and destroy yourself, remove your presidents, and actually end up being dismantled. And there's no solidarity, and if Kamala Harris were president, universities would not be getting along, we wouldn't be all in unison defending our mission, we would actually take ourselves apart. Secondly, the humanities are Are they more susceptible to politics? The STEM fields thought they were not. When I wrote a book 8 years ago on free speech, I talked to all my friends, and I have a lot of friends in the university who run departments of science, and I said, are you guys worried about this, the sort of merchants of doubt, culture wars, attack on elites? No, we don't read the Wall Street Journal, we only read scientific journals. And I said, really? The attack on scientific expertise in the Wall Street Journal, you don't pay attention? No, it's not for us. And I said, you should pay attention. And I said, no, that's your thing. That whole, you have like your free speech issues and it's on race and stuff. And I said, wow, really? I mean, I quoted Merchants of Doubt. It's a book. I mean, people have studied this for a long time, that actually the attack on science has been deliberate, intentional, strategic. And so now they're caught in something that they thought was a humanities thing. So I think, yes, particularly susceptible, because we deal with things that are not established, settled truth. Someone said this yesterday. In certain things, natural sciences, law of gravity is assumed. If you come into a physics class, you cannot say, I don't believe in the law of gravity. But you're like, well, you can leave now. You are not qualified. But if you don't believe in equality for, you know, gay people or something like that, or that women shouldn't be part of public life, that's supposed to be debatable. Thomas Jefferson said in Notes on the State of Virginia, I wish that equality and justice were as provable as a mathematical formula. And people would just believe it, but they don't. They have to be convinced over and over, continually, or be actually forced to accept it by a democratic process. And so the humanities are more open to this, I think, but I think it's a mistake for the other fields to have believed they were immune to this, as the Trump administration is proving. The ambivalence and complexity, yeah, my argument is sort of for that literature. I don't know what it really teaches us, but I teach in a very kind of wrong way for a lot of my colleagues. I teach all the books and poems I teach as moral dilemmas, and sort of say, what would you do if you were Janie, which I've been told many times that is the wrongest approach to literary characters. You know, so, but complexity, we would hope so. We would all like to be better people because we read a lot of books, but it's not always the case. People can become terrible people who've read a lot of books. So it's no real guarantee. And then the experience versus argument. So I was fortunate enough to be friendly with the director Claude Lanzmann, who made Shoah, the long documentary on the Holocaust. And Claude Lanzmann did a screening once in Paris a long time ago when the movie came out. And this was in the 70s, I believe. And the woman said, Mr. Lanzmann, thank you for this movie, but this is not what happened to my family. They were in Poland or somewhere. This is not what happened. He said, Madame, vous êtes une expérience, vous n'êtes pas un argument. Madam, you are an experience, you're not an argument. And he said, I made a film that is one argument. It is a long argument. It tells a story. It has a structure. And it puts all those experiences, what he considered incompatible, radically incommensurate. For him, the experiences of people who actually went through the camps and the people who perpetrated were not commensurate. They didn't map onto each other in a way that you could say, here's one story. They said they left gaps open. And this is the second part I want to get to with the Du Bois. They left something unsaid or unreconciled or incommensurate, what Jean-François Lyotard called a different, when two modes of discourse can't be mapped onto each other because one experience actually says, my experience is that you are denying me my experience, so therefore I cannot use your discourse to explain myself. And what Du Bois does in The Souls of Black Folk, for example, he says they were slave songs, there's music, and then he doesn't quote it. There's this thing out there, this expression of something, and I can't really give it back to you. He leaves something unspoken that is vitally important, that informs all of his practice and everything, and says, here's something. So he marks a spot where experience will not register in the idiom available to him as a sociologist, a historian, a political scientist. And I think the point of literature is to mark that spot and not to fill it in, to say, here's an unmarked spot for the yet unvoiced, and it's not to voice it and say, oh, I found the gap, and this is the voice of the oppressed, category number X that now I can give you, but to leave the spot open from which we are being addressed to then add something. Another metaphor for this was, I wrote a book once, and we used this metaphor from my friend Emily Sun, who's a scholar of Chinese poetry and romanticism. You cannot add a seat to parliament for each new member that has been discovered. You have to leave a seat empty. You have to leave a seat empty and say, this is for the person who has not yet been discovered or invented, who's sitting right here, whose identity is yet to be shaped. So you know what I mean? That to leave the spot open rather than to say, here's the blank spot, the inexpressible, and we're now going to give it a voice, a name, a category, a definition, etc., conceptual frame. Or Edouard Glissant, the theorist, says it's the claim of opacity, that some parts of it must remain opaque. Like Glissant said, to render yourself totally transparent to the other, to politics, to the law, is actually sacrificing your selfhood and this claim to opacity. So I would say this moment, literature marks the moment when something will not be expressed in another discourse. That can become a powerful tool for political liberation or political oppression. We don't know how it's going to go.
Okay, the last two questions go to Fintan O'Toole and Konstantin Gilbert.
Thank you very much. Listening to your wonderful talk, I was thinking about William Butler Yeats, who said, out of the argument with others, we make rhetoric. Out of the argument with ourselves, we make poetry. Yeah. And what he was trying to point to, I suppose, was that, I mean, all art, he's talking about poetry because he was a poet, but I think it's true of all art, isn't it? Which is that at least good art is always an argument with itself, and therefore is profoundly unsettling, because it contains and reenacts that, you know, self-contradiction. I mean, someone who is absolutely certain about what it is they're trying to say will probably make a very good political speech or write a very good argument, or maybe be a very good lawyer in court, but they won't write a great novel, you know. And what struck me listening to you was that, given that there's that unsettlement, you then have this resistance, and two different forms of resistance to unsettlement, which I thought maybe just map on to what you were talking about in terms of left and right, which are, you know, crude terms in this, but that the right resists unsettlement by imagining that society is, at least properly speaking, a completely settled network of rules and regulations and Christian civilization, and that, you know, so the reason to ban books and to hate literature and to hate the humanities is because they threaten to unsettle the social order. But what the left, if we want to call it that, has done is actually personalized unsettlement. So what it says is that actually the real sin is to make me feel uncomfortable, you know. And I suppose this is where, I mean, I think these are very different kinds of, if you can call them arguments, they're not really arguments, they're, you know, positing some sort of way of justifying attacks on art itself, but they come from these two different directions. And the one thing you could say is that the right one actually does pay literature the compliment of saying, well, yeah, we know it's really unsettling and that's why we hate it. Whereas the left sort of pretends to like it and then finds that once it's self-contradictory and therefore is opening you up as a participant in it into that realm of self-contradiction, that somehow, you know, that's not acceptable, and that therefore that sort of left-wing attack is more an attack on the experience of art than the right-wing stuff is. That's just what struck me.
If I add something, it's really interesting, Finn, thank you so much. I think what I would add is, I think the right resists this unsettlement and says there is some kind of absolute outside position, and it's usually Christianity or some kind of redemptive future, you know, so where we will be, or the glorious past or something like that. It's an absolute ideal that's unreachable for us, but we know it, right? So it's usually Christian. It's a religious way of reading it. And the other one, the unsettlement anchored in experience, that is actually supposed to be sort of available to us. As I just said, it's not available to us. Like, it didn't take Freud to discover the unconscious. People had it before, but you know. But the left makes a big mistake then and doesn't say, here's the experience. That I would say, the experience. I didn't start out by saying Zora Neale Hurston, the great Harlem Renaissance. I said it's Janie Crawford, who's a fictional invention who doesn't exist, that she speaks from this place. And the right then says, Zora Neale Hurston, black woman writer, and actually shifted identity to the author because it was a better way to solidify it into a political category. And I think they also, you're right, they're unsettled and they want to find one in this absolute point of view outside of us, transcendent eyeball, etc., or self-reliance in the wrong way as self-identity as a powerful political tool. And I'm throwing in Emerson here, self-reliance, because the self is an abyss in a very powerful, generative way, or in a very disturbing, alarming way. And I absolutely think you're right. So, and the first part you said, yeah, we cannot become conscious of our consciousness. It's, Dickens called the single hound of consciousness, always accompanies us. It's right there. She had a big dog named Carlo, but there was a nice dog. But consciousness, we are like, what did James say this morning? There's like a piece on your head you can't see, which Virginia Woolf says, right, size of a shilling or something like that. We're not totally self-aware. And the left, in a way, wants us to be totally self-aware. And as everybody in this room, I'm uncomfortable with that I am actually, I can be either aggrandized or diminished into an identity that you can all consume and absorb. And that is how the left settles it. And I think we all know that leftist identity politics have run into a dead end. And what did people tell me at lunch? Like, Mamdani, he's the hope of the future or something. As New Yorkers, we love to hear the fact that people abroad love this man more than we even knew, right? We live in New York, and like, we voted last week, and we're like, wow, the world has been galvanized by a dude from Queens or whatever, or whatever it is. So.
There hasn't been any other good news.
That's exactly, I grant you that. That's right. That's right.
Okay, Konstantin, now it's your turn.
Back to the issue of whether it's worse to be cancelled or censored.
Yeah.
I think the jury is really out on that one because, democracy didn't have the secret police, but communism didn't have Amazon, and it's not clear which instrument is more powerful. But I'm pretty sure that censorship is good for books because censors usually exercised very good artistic judgment. A friend of mine used to run a cabaret in Warsaw in the 70s, and he had to bring the script of the program to the censorship office, and he said he always dreaded the moment when the censor would burst out laughing because he knew that part will be cut. And, okay, cabaret is not a big deal, but authors who were well seen by the authorities had their books published in the dozens of thousands and then discreetly pulped. People wouldn't buy them. People wouldn't buy them, not because they read the stuff and found it stinks. They believe that somebody who is promoted by the authorities automatically stinks and doesn't deserve to be read. It didn't help even the authorities allowed them to print porn. People still wouldn't read it. And if somebody was promoted too much, we had cases of readers going to the apartments of authors with books they'll dump on their doorstep. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, books that were published in the underground not only had respectable print runs, limited only by the amount of paper we could lay our hands on, but after '89, turned out that the library of the Central Committee in Warsaw was full of samizdat. It didn't have their authors. It had our authors. The explanation, of course, being know your enemy, right? But frankly, the books that the censor wants to ban are usually more fun to read. And I would suspect that this is a universal quality that does not respect the left-right division. I mean, anything that gets in the way of cancel culture automatically arouses my interest.
Well, except that the right adopted the logic of the left, which is it bans books by writers of color, regardless of what they wrote. They could have written a cookbook. It doesn't matter. So in some ways, they adopted exactly the identity logic of the canon wars and said, we're going to just eliminate books written by. So yes, good, maybe. I don't know. Jenny, you have one more comment. That's just, And then
Okay, please. Okay, wait. This is getting
You're
out of
doing it.
hand now. Okay, we have. Okay, we can. I think we have. If we're taking you, we're also taking Peter Gallison, but you're definitely the last two questions.
Thank you.
And we're going to take them in a row. So you have to keep quiet
I
until
will.
both of them have.
And I will be brief, I promise.
Sorry.
I will be brief. This is a gift. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Uli, I'm sorry, I'm just wondering. I feel like you're looking for a place that you've described very clearly, which is.
Please, can everybody? It's really hard to hear if everybody's talking. So please. So now.
I feel like you're looking for a place that you've described very clearly, which is this place, as you put it, outside in literature, this place of imagination, this embodied place, this place that doesn't, in some ways, have any accountability to politics. And then you're looking for a place for that within the divided political culture that we are now living in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if, the problem is that if you find a place, that space will become politicized. So you're in a catch-22 that is not resolvable, and I wonder what you do with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
On the question of cancellation and censorship, I think that the more it's evident that something's been removed, the better it is for those who are being censored. There was a moment in the First World War where the Austrians they would censor by putting white spaces over the things they didn't want to be published, and the censors themselves were quite aware that this was drawing attention to the missing words. And one of the journals wrote and said the best parts are always in the white spaces, and it's great, you're making it evident, this is where the eye goes. But the Austrian censors were very admiring of the German censors, because in Germany, they didn't remove things and leaving a white space or a dark space, which was what the Russians called caviar at that time for their censorship. And the Austrian censors said the Germans are much better at this. What they do is they retype, they relay out the format, and you can't tell what's been removed. I think that the problem with cancel culture, as it's applied, or whatever you want to call that, is it's often hard to know what you're missing. Whereas, the more generic it is, the harder it is to elevate the reduced item. If it's a specific book by a well-known author, then you can put it on the table at the local bookstore, and it becomes a point of pride. But if if everything's missing, then by an author, then you don't know what it doesn't have that same salience. And this all had a big effect on Freud, by the way, for how he understood censorship to function in the mind. But anyway, just some thoughts on censorship.
Just two really quick comments. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, this place of kind of exhilarating freedom that at one end you can share with others, but that is not legal or political yet, because that is what art can provide. It will be politicized, be claimed, okay, fine, and yet we must insist on it over and over the way you did this morning. It happens once. It's very important. If you lose that space and everything is already politicized, you lose that moment of thinking freely, creatively outside of these structures, even if they are benevolent and on your side. Everything has already been categorized in this way. And to sort of Peter's comment, so the hard thing is that we now live in a world where things can disappear for good, and we don't know there was a book published or something. Tiananmen Square, I opened a university in China, and I teach a lot of Chinese students, and Tiananmen Square is coded in a certain way. June 4th, you have 4 people sitting in front of 6 people, the dates, but it doesn't exist. And there are huge amounts of people who don't know it ever happened, and this will happen because people will not just erase the one book and say, here's famous author who wrote 2 books and one of them is missing, but famous author doesn't show up. Tomorrow we're going to talk about, Thomas is going to talk about AI. AI will not recognize that someone existed if enough people don't. So there's a weird way in,
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, is that the more it's evident that there's a hole in what we see, the better it is for us.
Yes.
The less clear it is where the hole in our knowledge is, the worse.
Yeah, and maybe my plea is like what Jenny was trying to say, like I do believe in the university's function and teaching and actually to remind people what's out there. And there is a canon, there are books, there are these experiences, because we have a generation that now lives on the phone, and if they can't find it, and if you're not on Wikipedia, you don't exist. Or it's not misinformation only, but it's also not knowing anymore what's real, what's not real. All of these things are, that's why things like this are actually important. In a weird way, as strange as an academic conference is as a genre, it's more important than before to let people share information and be validated and have an experience and talk about it and say, this actually was talked about and someone knows this. Because the media we live in will not have traces of what was erased, right, outside of very technical ones. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let me thank you for a wonderful talk and for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.